Let us start with the preliminary homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Let us now pay respect to the Triple Gem. Arahang Sama Sambuddho Bhagava Buddhang Bhagavantang Abhivademi. Swakato Bhagavata Dhammo Dhammang Namasami. Supatipano Bhagavato Sāvaka Sangho Sanghang Namami. Let us now go for the refuge to the Triple Gem. Buddhang saranang gacchami, Dhammang saranang gacchami, Sanghang saranang gacchami, Dutiyampi Buddhang saranang gacchami, Dutiyampi Dhammang saranang gacchami, Dutiyampi Sanghang saranang gacchami, Tatiyampi Buddhang saranang gacchami, Tatiyampi Dhammang saranang gacchami, Tatiyampi Sanghang saranang gacchami. We will now chant the observance of the 5 precepts. Panatipata veramani sikapadang samadhiyami. Adinadana veramani sikapadang samadhiyami. Kamesu micacara veramani sikapadang samadhiyami. Musavada veramani sikapadang samadhiyami. Surameraya majapamadatana veramani sikapadang samadhiyami. Let us recollect the sublime qualities of the Buddha. Iti piso bhagava arahang sama sambuddho vijacarana sampano sugato lokavidu anutaro purisa dhammasarati satta dewa manusanang buddho bhagavati. Let us recollect the sublime qualities of Dhamma. Swakato bhagavata Dhammo sanditiko akaliko ehipasiko openaiko pacatang veditabo vinyuhiti. Let us now recollect the sublime qualities of Sangha. Supatipano bhagavato sāvaka sangho. Ujjupatipano bhagavato sāvaka sangho. Nyayapatipano bhagavato sāvaka sangho. Samicipatipano bhagavato sāvaka sangho. Yadidang cattari purisa yugani atta purisa puggala esa bhagavato sāvaka sangho. Ahuneyo pahuneyo dakineyo anjali karaniyo anuttara punyaketang lokasati. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
Good morning, brothers and sisters in the Dharma. Today, we are very fortunate to have Venerable Canda all the way from England, who will be giving us a talk titled Solitude versus Loneliness. Venerable Canda, born in England in 1975, came into contact with the Buddha's teachings in India at the age of 20. She decided to devote the rest of her life to ending suffering through practicing the Buddha's teachings. In 2006, she went to Burma to take ordination under Sayadaw U Panyajota. By 2010, the ascetic lifestyle, climate, and diet in Burma has taken its toll on Venerable Canda's health, leading to a return to the West. After 2 years as a wandering nun in Europe, Venerable Canda traveled to Australia after a chance discovery of Ajahn Brahm's teaching in 2012. She joined the Dhammasaram community in Perth and took Bhikkhuni ordination in 2014, with Ayya Santini as a preceptor. In October 2015, Ajahn Brahm asked her to take steps towards establishing a nuns' monastery in the UK, and she has been there since. Venerable will first lead us in a 10-minute guided meditation, followed by a Dhamma talk, and afterwards we'll have our Q&A session. Let's welcome Venerable.
Good morning, everybody. Today I'm going to give a teaching on the subject of solitude versus loneliness. So we're going to explore that, what the two terms mean, and whether they are actually in opposition or perhaps even not so different from each other. So let's see how we can unfold that theme. But I'd like to start with a short meditation just to settle us in. So the meditation will be for about 10 minutes. After that, we'll have a Dhamma reflection for about 45-50 minutes, and followed by some question and answers. So this is always an important part of learning the Dhamma. We have to apply it to ourselves, make it relevant, and actually use the opportunity to ask any questions, to clarify any doubts, and to gain a deeper understanding on this theme or on any theme you wish. So let's settle in and make ourselves comfortable. So choosing, first of all, a posture that is suitable for your body, not for the way you'd like your body to be, but for how your body actually is right now. You may have seen pictures in books of maybe even bhikkhunis. Usually it's monks, but sometimes nuns meditating cross-legged with a straight back. You may think that's the way to do it. That's the fast track to enlightenment. But really, the fast track is always being kind and taking care and listening to the feedback from your own body. So if you wish, you can sit cross-legged, of course. If you prefer, you could sit on a chair so that your knees are not having any strain on them at all. If you're tired, although it's the morning, who knows, sometimes we can wake up tired. You may wish to lie down in a comfortable position and just really give yourself this gift of relaxation and silence. And if you wish, you can gently close your eyes, if that's comfortable for you. Noticing the absence of the visual world, worlds of sights, colors, shapes. And coming into the feeling world, the world of sensations, physical sensations in the body, maybe emotions in the mind. And see if you can extend a welcome to every experience that arises in the body and the mind, as though you were greeting a very dear friend or perhaps a group of friends. And asking those friends how they are. Perhaps spreading your awareness from the top of the head, imbuing that awareness with kindness and care, and allowing it to flow down like ink dropped into a glass of water, spreading, flowing downward, outward to every part of your body. Illuminating any sensations that you find along the way. And caring for those sensations, those physical bodily feelings. Those feelings that tell you you're here, present, now. You maybe want to take a long breath out like a sigh and just let everything relax. Letting tensions, struggles fade and melt away. And noticing how, although you're in silence right now, although you are taking a dip into your inner world, sitting secluded, alone, you're doing this in the company of spiritual friends. a community in which you belong, in which you're accepted and embraced for who you are. A community who understand the beauty and the purpose of solitude and are silently supporting you in enjoying a few minutes alone. You're safe. You belong. You're at ease. Just enjoying this simple moment of quiet time. Simply being present and caring for your body and mind. And in doing so, you're supporting all the people joining today to be present to their own inner world. Alone and yet connected in this wonderful global spiritual family. Enjoying a few more moments of silence. So precious, so rare. Before gently expressing gratitude towards yourself for offering yourself this beautiful gift of silence, and gratitude to all those who've been silent together with us for this short meditation. May we all be happy. May we all be peaceful. May we all be liberated from all suffering. So I don't have a bell, but you may wish to take just 2 or 3 more breaths, and then on the last breath, if you wish, you can gently open your eyes. And gently means that you're not too quickly drawn out into the world of sights into the screen on the computer again, but a part of the mind remains inside, connected to any physical feelings, connected to your emotional world. So that when I start the Dhamma talk, a part of the mind is listening from the heart, allowing the Dhamma to soak in, not worrying so much about the content, but just see how and if it touches you at all. Very good. So it's a brief meditation, but it's important to know that meditation doesn't have to last for an hour, right? Because sometimes we think we don't have an hour. We only have 5 minutes. We only have a minute. Sometimes we don't even notice that we have a minute. We just fill it up with all sorts of other things. But actually, there is always a moment in life. There's always a moment in the day that you can just stop, slow down, maybe even close your eyes. And this can be very resourcing, because we're so often dragged outside into the world of sight, sound, taste, touch, smell, and of course into the thinking mind. And solitude might not be a comfortable thought for many of us, because it could imply a sense of aloneness, maybe even a sense of loneliness. Perhaps some of us think of it as a punishment, being in solitude or being in isolation. For example, in a prison, somebody goes into solitary confinement, and that's usually a punishment for some very grievous wrongdoing. And yet it's been shown, in prisons that putting people into solitary confinement is actually counterproductive and doesn't necessarily reduce levels of violence seen in the prisons. Some of us may have different relationships with the idea of solitude. We may find it sounds almost like a relief, like a precious opportunity for time out, for peace. And yet loneliness and solitude don't have to be opposites. I think it's quite possible to experience loneliness and to embrace that loneliness, not to need to push it away, not to need to hide from it, or feel that something's gone wrong. We can be lonely in solitude, or we can be lonely in a crowd. Sometimes we're around other people and we feel really disconnected from ourselves, or perhaps we're around the wrong kinds of people that we don't really relate to. And for me personally, the times I felt most alone are when I am in company, and yet there is an emotional disconnect. So I think loneliness is not so much a situation of being alone, it's more of an emotional state of mind, a kind of emotional sense of isolation. And this can be because we're not connecting with the people around us. We're starting to shrink into our own little world. Or sometimes it can be because we're not really connected to ourselves. We haven't made peace with our inner world. We're still fighting ourselves. We're still not at ease in the world of the mind. So for me, this theme is very pertinent. It's obviously pertinent to Buddhist practice, because it's in those states of aloneness or solitude that we can enter, or we have an opportunity to experience the depths of the mind and to experience deep meditation. And of course, it's also pertinent to the times, this pandemic time, because a lot of us have been forced into situations of isolation and solitude that we may not have, experienced before, let alone wished for. And so I think it's been very challenging for all of us, and even for myself, as somebody who loves and delights in solitude and has given much of my life to the cultivation of being alone, being alone in a beautiful way, to go into the depths of my heart and mind. Still, this Rains retreat, the one that just happened now, for me was one of the most difficult of my whole monastic life. And I've been now a monastic for 16 years. It's quite a long time. Nobody really likes to admit that, because you think, oh, I'm not enlightened yet, and it's 16 years. But still, it gives you a lot of experience with the mind and with the working with various emotional states that arise. And as I say, I love solitude. And so I'd arranged the situation this year because I couldn't get to Perth. Normally I spend my rains in Perth with Ajahn Brahm, and I've been doing that for the last 8 years. But now for the last 2, I couldn't get over there because of I was isolated from my Sangha, and I was alone over here without a monastic Sangha around. So my trust, the Anukampa Bhikkhuni Project Charitable Trust, rented a cottage in a rural area of Wiltshire for me to spend my 3 months rains retreat. I was actually there for 4 months. And it was really interesting because although on the one hand it was quite nourishing and I enjoyed the tranquility of the environment and I felt very much connected to the nature, to various trees. I usually get out into these beautiful places and immediately find my favorite trees that I create a connection with, and it feels as though there's a relationship there too. So there was a beautiful big beech tree at the bottom of the garden, and it's sort of overlooked another field with lots of baby cows, and I used to chant metta to these cows and they'd come and listen. I was testing it. They were not coming for the grass, they were coming for the metta. So I had a lot of happy memories from that time, and yet I also met the edge of where solitude meets loneliness and isolation. And this was something quite new for me, probably because it was already on the back of 1.5 years of living alone. And so moving out into the countryside away from my community that I developed in Oxford was just that step a little bit too far into a sense of loneliness that could sometimes feel quite uneasy. But it was interesting because I have another teacher apart from Ajahn Brahm. Ajahn Brahm's my main Kalyana Mitta, and we work very well together, both as colleagues, and of course he's my teacher, he's my Dhamma guardian, if you like, and spiritual friend. But there's another teacher too, who I met in Myanmar and have kept in contact with over the years. And I spoke to him and said, sometimes it's quite difficult. There's these feelings of loneliness. And he said, but what do you want? So what? What do you want? I was like, oh, yes, quite right. And then further, he said that this is something to be expected and something that's an inevitable part of every person's spiritual path. At some time in our journey, we have to go through periods of intense loneliness to the point sometimes of despair. I mean, it's not that we have to, but it may be quite likely that we will, because we are, in a sense, doing a deep excavation of the contents and the depth of the mind. And it's confronting at the time. It can be challenging. It can be something we are resisting and we don't want to feel. But it's really only when we're able to start treating our so-called demons as friends that we have an opportunity to understand things more fully. So the Buddha said, that dukkha, suffering, and that can include loneliness, anxiety, depression, even just not getting what we want, right? Suffering. It's not satisfying. It's not enough for us. There's a sense of lack. This is all part of the realm of dukkha, of suffering. And suffering is not to be avoided. Suffering is to be understood. Yeah. So, of course, the whole aim of the Buddhist path is to transcend, if you like, suffering, although I think that's a difficult word because it can have connotations of pushing things away. But ironically, the way to let go, the way to transcend, the way to arrive at a place of deep contentment and peace is actually to meet that suffering, maybe not always head on, but to meet it in a way that's gentle, in a way that's curious, and in a way that even learns to welcome unpleasant, unwanted states of mind. Yeah. So loneliness doesn't have to be something negative. It can be something that helps us go deeper on the path. And in the same way, solitude, it doesn't have to be something negative. It can be something very, very beautiful indeed. So I wanted to talk today about solitude as an essential part of the Buddhist path, an essential part of deepening our meditation, and how to define solitude, how to define loneliness, and also to look at how much solitude is really desirable and when is too much, right? Also, I want to look at the causes and the supports for the healthy kind of solitude. Yeah, because solitude isn't always recommended, even by the Buddha. Even in the Buddha's day, there were monks who came to him and said, I want to go into the forest, I want to go into solitude. And there was a monk, I think his name was Magia, I think, but I might be wrong because I couldn't find the sutta again today. And he said to the Buddha, I want to go into the forest. And the Buddha said, no, don't say that, don't say that. But he kept insisting. And according to the Buddhist texts, we usually have to ask 3 times. And normally people back down on the 3rd, but he didn't. So he asked 3 times, he got the same answer. And eventually the Buddha just gave up on him and said, okay, you do what you have to do. And he went into the forest and of course didn't last very long, right? Because the Buddha could see that he wasn't ready. And there was another story as well. It's one of the first places in the suttas that the Buddha talks about metta and the practice of loving kindness, not as an antidote to aversion, but as an antidote to fear. And in a similar way, there were some monks who wanted to go out into the forest. It could have been nuns, but in this case, it was monks. Maybe nuns have more metta. That's a bit sexist, but I have to stand up for the nuns. So, so these monks went out into the forest and meditated all night. And they got really disturbed by what they thought were some tree spirits or some, spirits, maybe some demons that didn't actually want them to be there. And so these demons made a bit of a fuss and made a lot of scary noises and really freaked out these poor bhikkhus who were trying to meditate. And so they went back to the Buddha and kind of came running back. Don't send us there again. This was really scary, this was really unpleasant. We never want to meditate there anymore. And the Buddha said, practice metta. It's because you didn't have enough metta that these spirits could disturb you. Perhaps it's because the spirits wanted to have some metta. I think sometimes invisible beings come and pay us a visit because there's something they want from us. But it could also be that, having that metta within ourselves protects us from the difficult feelings. It protects us from fear because we feel so resourced, so confident in our own inner virtue, our own inner goodness, that nothing outside can really harm us very much. Metta is considered a protection. Yeah, the Brahma Viharas are the protective meditations, the divine abodes. And so metta is a protection against this kind of fear that can arise in silent, scary places. So we're going to look at the supports for solitude and also some of its fruits. And it was interesting when I was thinking about this theme this morning, the thought occurred to me that the same things that are supports for solitude are also antidotes for loneliness. And you'll see what I mean later on. But they seem to be very similar, okay? So we don't go into solitude when we're already feeling marginalized or alone or a lack of belonging. One of the supports for solitude is actually a sense of belonging. And that is the same, isn't it, as an antidote to loneliness. So solitude, how do we define it? And in the dictionaries that I looked up, it's defined as a quality or state of being alone or remote from society. So we're talking here about physical solitude. It can also be seclusion. And in Pali, seclusion is viveka. It's something that's very much recommended. You can have physical seclusion, kaya viveka, or mental seclusion, chitta viveka. So seclusion, and usually that refers to seclusion from unwholesome states, and also to some extent, of course, seclusion from the world. Even when we close our eyes in meditation, we're secluding ourselves from the world of sight, right? And later, as you go deeper in meditation, you seclude yourself from other senses. The smell and the taste is obviously very dim because we're not, unless you've got incense on or something, you're not really eating when you meditate normally. Although, of course, you can eat mindfully. And eventually, even the sound turns off when we get really within ourselves, and the physical bodily feelings as well. And I think that the key thing about solitude as opposed to loneliness is that it's usually a choice. It's something we desire, ideally, yes. It's something that's voluntary, and it can come from a place of actually feeling quite connected and quite integrated in society. But then we choose to have times alone. We choose to have times to ourselves. Maybe it's even when you meditate in the evening, you have an hour to yourself, or 10 minutes, 1 minute, whatever it is. It could be retreat periods that you choose to take out of your busy life, maybe a 3-day retreat, or these days an online retreat. These are all periods of solitude, and you have the opportunity afterwards. You know that you can come back to your family, to your friends, to a community. And so that sense of belonging really supports your time on retreat. It's not really something that's necessarily rejection of life. And yet loneliness is a bit different, because it tends to arise it can arise in solitude, but it can also, as we said, arise when we're with others as well. So it's more of an emotional state of mind. It can be a physical isolation, obviously through COVID, many of us have experienced that. And sometimes it can arise when we move from one place to the next. So at the moment, I'm dealing with this because we don't yet have a permanent place for me to stay here in the UK. We have a project called Anukampa Bhikkhuni Project, on which Ajahn Brahm is the spiritual advisor and comes usually to England every year. And we have done a lot. We've done a lot of work. We've raised considerable amount of donations from people all over the world. And I've been having very successful online talks with quite a consistent group of people throughout the COVID pandemic. And that's been really wonderful and created a kind of global network and a sense of community, even though it's been online. And yet, because of various situations over here, we haven't yet been able to find a permanent base. And so I've moved around, I think, four different places in the last month. And I'm no longer in Oxford. And so every time we move, we have to meet the people, we have to get used to a new environment, the new trees. That's very important to me, because I make friends with the trees, and I miss my Oxford trees, I have to say. And so this can also trigger feelings of loneliness, because we're not yet integrated in a place. And so loneliness is usually something that we don't desire. It's usually more involuntary. And I think compared to solitude, it's a little bit more of a contracted state of mind. Like solitude for me, and I guess if we learn to bring solitude into our life bit by bit, it can feel quite expansive. It can feel like a freedom, like a release, almost a relief, to have this space, this time to yourself. It can feel like a very expansive sort of experience. And whereas loneliness tends to press in on us, it tends to feel like a contraction, and the sense of self gets kind of consolidated. We feel very separate from others. In solitude, I often feel extremely connected to others, which is interesting. And yet solitude is not necessarily positive or negative. It depends on the situation. Solitude has its benefits, and I want to talk a little bit about some of those before talking about how it can also be difficult in various situations. And I think, speaking for myself as an empath and someone very sensitive to other people's energies, and to, especially where some people are suffering, it tends to affect me. I pick that up. Or maybe if you're an introverted kind of person and, you just feel a little bit overstimulated or bombarded by too much sense impression, too much company, then solitude can give you a really wonderful opportunity to kind of discharge, to process the feelings, the emotions, the, sensory input that you've been taking in throughout the day or the week, and also to recharge your energy and come back to the world a little bit fresher. As I said, I think it gives a heightened sense of connection to nature and even to others. I often find when I am meditating, especially on a longer retreat, that I feel more connected to the people in my life. Perhaps I see them differently, I get a different perspective on who they are, on their behavior, on the role they play in my life. I remember years and years ago in my first retreat, remembering my auntie, and my auntie is someone that I really don't know very much. I only have one anyway. And she's my mother's brother's wife. My mother doesn't see her brother very often, so I don't really know this auntie. But suddenly I felt really connected. It became obvious that, yeah, she is part of my life, and I could reflect on who she is, not maybe as someone I know closely, but kind of her essence in this world, like her goodness, her simplicity, just, yeah, the sort of sense of knowing these people and appreciating that they are there in your life. And I often feel more connected to everybody when I'm in retreat. And it's almost as though at the end, when we have our conversations, those words seem to put some distance there, because we're trying to define things. We're trying to express things, emotions, feelings, experiences in language. And language always falls short of real experience. So I noticed, especially in the 10-day retreats I used to do very often, and also longer retreats that were completely solitary. And we even had really full sense restraint, whereby we wouldn't look at another person. We'd just keep our eyes downcast for the whole period of retreat. And at the end, you never really wanted to do the small talk. It didn't seem relevant. So you'd start talking about somebody from your heart. And you'd feel that you knew this person, even if you only knew their shoes. It's like you suddenly put their shoes to their face. Oh, you're the one with these pink flip-flops. And straight away, the conversation was very profound, very open, and in a sense exposed, but in a beautiful way, because you felt that you'd made a connection in a place of safety and in a place of truth, from a place of truth, being aligned with the reality of how things are. So sometimes you wouldn't even know their name, but you'd have the most wonderful conversations. And that's something that's not always obvious to people who don't go on retreat. Maybe they feel like they're losing us when we go away for a long time, but they're actually not. We also have the opportunity to send metta, don't we, after we purify our minds and hearts on retreat. And that also connects us more to others. And sometimes they feel that, they pick it up. Yeah, at the very least, they know that you're a safe and a good person. You're not going to hurt them. You're not going to confront them in any way. And I think that, the solitude gives us an opportunity to quieten down the senses and the thinking mind. Yeah. The thinking mind is sometimes quite out of control because we've been using thought a lot throughout the day. Maybe, initially there were reflections or flashbacks of conversations we've had, and that goes around the mind for some time. But eventually it starts to quieten. And I remember my first experience of prolonged silence really was after ordaining in Myanmar. That was in 2006. And I felt I'd landed there and I was staying there for life. I still would be there probably if it wasn't for my health kind of giving out on me at that time, about 4 years later. So I had to leave. But I remember that after 2 or 3 months of dedicated meditation and feeling this sense of real belonging and real peace, feeling that I'd arrived, at last, after a long spiritual search, I'd arrived in the place I wanted to stay for the rest of my life. The thoughts just stopped. Not completely, because I'm sure I must have had thoughts outside of the meditation, but in the meditation for weeks and even months, there was just nothing to think about anymore. I'd landed and I was happy and I had all this time to meditate. And so the thinking mind just was silenced, and there was so much more inner contentment as a result. Solitude also gives us a chance to understand how our minds work, how we react with craving to sensations or experiences that we find pleasant, how we react with aversion, wanting to push things away, or even just a subtle sense of resistance, like sometimes we can be like, I'll stay with you, I'll be equanimous to you, so long as you go away, right? Sometimes the mindfulness is slightly conditional. So we're like, okay, I'm supposed to be mindful and accept this experience, so I'll do that. But then, in an hour or so, it should go away, right? Or less. But that's not real equanimity. That's not real contentment. Contentment means being content right within the place that it hurts, right within the loneliness, right inside the feelings of anxiety that may arise, really being so content that you don't want to push it away. You're just curious, you open your heart to it gently and kindly, with patience, with gentleness, and with respect. So we learn to work with our mind. We learn to look at our emotions and unpack them a little bit. see not only that they are arising, but how they arise and how we fuel those things, especially when we don't want them to be there, we're fueling them. Or when we go into thoughts, about how it should be, or thoughts that kind of resonate with the emotional frequency we experienced. For example, we might be feeling lonely, and then we remember all the other times in our lives that we felt lonely, and all the lonely thoughts that come up, I'll always be alone. No one really loves me. No one really cares. I don't matter. My life doesn't matter to anybody. I've been abandoned. Nobody wants me around. It doesn't make any difference to others whether I'm here or not. Have you had these kind of thoughts? They're really painful thoughts. And sometimes we slip into them so quickly that we're not aware we're actually reacting to our experience, to our present moment experience that can manifest as a feeling in the body. So if we learn to be able to actually stay with that feeling, stay with the emotional aspect of the experience of loneliness, which can arise in the heart. For me, it can arise in the chest. And it's an unpleasant thing to look at first. But if I can really develop a lot of kindness in my mind and then gradually just touch into that, it's actually not as bad as we think, It's actually not going to hurt us really. It's just a feeling, it's just an emotion. And we don't have to stay there too long. You can go in like tiptoeing into, I don't know, a cold pool or something. You don't just jump straight in, you tiptoe in a bit, you get used to the cold, and then bit by bit, you can go in a little bit deeper. In the same way, we can come in toward those feelings in ourselves bit by bit, get familiar, get comfortable, and then only go in a little bit further, or go in, come out, go in, come out. Yeah. And also expand the mind. I think this is really helpful when the mind becomes contracted and stuck in any particular state of mind. We have this thing called a negativity bias in psychology, that our mind tends to hone in on the bits that are difficult and that, we think we need to fix. And sometimes there's a lot of other stuff going on inside as well that we don't notice. So yes, there might be a feeling of loneliness, and you might be conditioned to react to that as something unpleasant. But if you look more closely, there might be something very tender, almost vulnerable, almost beautiful in that. Like sometimes sadness can have a certain beauty to it, something a little bit profound that connects us with others too. And sometimes under that is actually something very soft, like a tender child that just wants care, just wants a bit of attention and comfort. Other times, we might find that if we spread our awareness to other parts of the body, there's pleasant sensations going on. So, you may have pleasant experiences in your hands, for example, the hands, the extremities, and the soles of the feet. The top of the head is another place that usually we have fairly pleasant sensations. If you shave your head like me, you'll feel a lot of sensations in this area. And, we can put our attention there. That also widens the awareness. It widens this feeling of mindfulness. And even widen it beyond your body if the sensations inside are really difficult to stay with. And then you have a bigger context, a bigger perspective for those feelings of loneliness or despair, whatever they are. So we get this familiarity through the solitude of working in our inner world. And that's why these two things are not really in opposition. Loneliness can be a part of solitude. It can also be a part of everyday life, right? But in both cases, we need to develop a healthy relationship to them, a healthy relationship to solitude so that we can reap the benefits, and a healthy relationship to loneliness so that we can learn and understand suffering at a deeper level, become more familiar with our minds. And of course, through the solitude and through the practice, we have an opportunity for insight to arise. And insight arises to the degree that the 5 hindrances are overcome. So as the 5 hindrances start to dissipate in the mind, and these are states of mind such as craving, aversion, doubt, restlessness and worry, and sleepiness, tiredness, drowsiness. These are things that sort of obscure the mind from seeing clearly. The Buddha called them obscurations of the mind, which weaken wisdom. And so when we're practicing, these things have a chance to die down, and we develop skillful means to overcome them so that insight can arise. And then as our samadhi, as our stillness develops, we have a chance to stay with things for long enough that they start to open up and reveal their nature. So we don't just experience pain, for example, but we actually notice that through the pain in the body, and this can be physical pain now, there's like pulsing, or there's throbbing, or there's heat. There's different intensities in that same area. For example, if your knee hurts, some parts might be like a dull pain, other parts might be a sharp pain, some parts may be just hot. And also there'll be a part just beyond that, which is fine, which is quite comfortable. So we start to see that these things are, not solid. These things are actually arising and passing as we speak, right? Not just that they arise and pass, but that they are arising and passing every second, every moment. And with the insight practice, this becomes very clear. We can actually feel every sensation, even consolidated sensations like pain, as oscillation, just almost like energy, a field of energy in the body and mind. And at that point, the equanimity grows very strong, and we're able to really develop that unconditional awareness that is able to stay present with experience and remain, the mind can remain content. And then we're really developing a lot of strength. We're not only depending on things going our way or feelings in the body being pleasant for our happiness. We can be happy even inside pain, physical pain. We can be happy even when things don't go our way. Yeah, we can be happy even if we're bored. Even boredom can be interesting sometimes if we look at it carefully. It also has its phases, it also has its shades. And eventually, of course, in solitude, we have an opportunity to develop deep meditation, so to actually absorb into our object of meditation. So we make peace with the breath. We learn to befriend our breath. And at first it's boring. Our mind bounces off it. You think, what's here? This is so dull. Just another breath and another breath. And whoops, the mind's gone somewhere else. But after a while, we develop so much contentment that the mind just doesn't want to go anywhere else. And we start to see the beauty in the breath. We start to see the nuance in the breath. And the mind starts to settle and find the breath almost like a place to rest the mind. And until it rests so deeply that the mind and the breath become one. And that's when we can enter really deep states of seclusion. The Buddha talked about the states of jhana as states of seclusion. Yeah, secluded from unwholesome states, secluded. It actually says from the sense pleasure, but really it means this 5 sense world. And this is real solitude that happens within the mind. So I'm going to skip a few parts of the talk that I wanted to go into because we've already spoken quite a lot about the meditation practice, but I did also want to speak about some of the ways and supports for us to develop a healthy relationship with solitude. And as I said before, somewhat counterintuitively, I think a sense of belonging is one of the necessary supports for solitude. So that when we go into solitude, we make a choice from a place of connection, from a place of feeling held, feeling that our lives matter, that we are a part of a community, our lives have a meaning, and that community will benefit also from our time in solitude. So we're not rejecting others, but we're actually supporting others by taking time out for our own practice. And this is especially obvious when we practice in community, in spiritual communities with similar values and aims. So that's the ideal kind of environment for solitude, to be in the context of a community who live together in harmony and who develop states of solitude together in support of each other. Ajahn Brahm describes his monastery in Perth as a community of hermits. And again, it's almost like an oxymoron, right? How can you be a community of hermits? And like, if you're a hermit, how can you be in community? But the whole point here is that, being in community also takes some work. It's not that easy to live in harmony, and it takes a certain amount of cultivation of learning to drop or in a way, drop our selfish desires, right? And learn to compromise with others and to, perform actions of body and speech that contribute something and that are not just based on what we would like, but that support the other people around us. And I think it's when we've developed such harmonious communities that the solitude really takes off, because you feel safe inside that community. So safe that you feel you can take time out and nothing's going to go wrong. You don't always have to be there making everybody else happy. You don't always have to be there in order for the work to get done. You work as a unit. And if you take time out, somebody else is serving. When they're serving or when you're serving, someone else can take time out in solitude. And we learn that, by being in solitude, we're actually supporting other people, even though it might not always seem that way. I make a strong commitment every year to do my 3 months of the Rains retreat, even though I sometimes think, how will my online community be, especially during the corona pandemic? It's like, many of them say that the weekly talks really support them through that period, and they can't imagine getting through it without these talks. Just the fact that we're meeting together and we're feeling like we're holding this together is so supportive. But I still make my resolution to take that time out. And I have received messages from people to say it's so inspiring for them that somebody else is practicing. And one lady wrote and said, I know that I can't do that. I don't have the chance to do that. I have children, I have a family, but it makes me very happy that someone else can do it, And so this sense of self starts to dissolve. It doesn't really matter who's doing it. We're doing it for each other, right? Everybody will get their chance. And if we can't do that now, we can cultivate other factors of the path. We can cultivate right speech, right intention, right livelihood, right action. Someone else is now cultivating, right samadhi, sama samadhi, or sama sati, yeah? So we focus on different things at different times, but in a community where where we're living together for a certain aim, especially a monastery where most people anyway, have ordained for the sake of the freedom and the ending of suffering. And so everything goes in support of that. There's an understanding of what solitude means and where it comes in the path. Yeah. And a very inspiring example of somebody who went into deep solitude is a nun, a bhikkhuni. I think she's the most senior white bhikkhuni in the world. So she's English as well. And she's been ordained even longer than Ajahn Brahm in the Tibetan tradition. She's now about 78 and she ordained at the age of 19. And we had a chat with her last week. We organized a wonderful Q&A session and she was kind enough to come for the benefit of our community, who were delighted. And you may have heard of her. Her name is Jetsunma Tenzin Palmo, and she is the subject matter of the book, The Cave in the Snow, which was written quite a long time ago. I think by my age, 46, she'd already been in the cave and emerged after 12 years of complete solitude, right? On a mountain in a cave. I think the cave was like 6 foot square or something, and 3,000 meter altitude in the Himalaya, a very remote region, I think Spiti of the Himalaya. And yet, it was really interesting because we asked her, the most popular question actually was like, did you experience loneliness? And she actually said she didn't, which is quite incredible, right? In 12 years, not to experience loneliness. But then I looked more closely at her life and I realized that one of the reasons was because she'd done the preparation work. So not only was there already a sense of belonging, a sense of being part of a community, part of a tradition, part of a lineage, right? Also part of a culture in India that understands the idea of Santa Munis, silent sages, that understands the idea of those who go forth and who leave the world. So she was doing it in this kind of context. She wasn't completely isolated, right? It wasn't a completely alien concept. There was actually some support for that. But moreover, she had prepared her mind. And I think this is so important. The whole gradual training in the Pali Canon talks about preparing our mind in readiness for going to the foot of a tree or for going to a cave or a quiet place. It prepares us for this. And in Jetsunma's case, she had actually trained already for 6 years around her teacher, doing some admin work, so in a busy kind of monastery, and then a further 6 years in a sort of midway monastery that was in the mountains, but that had other nuns. And she developed her mind to the degree, I think, of, the first jhana, as far as I remember from the book. I may be wrong, so, read the book, because I don't want to misquote her life or, misrepresent her path. But I think she'd developed quite a steady mind, at the very least, before her teacher allowed her to go to the cave. So not only had she got the readiness, she also had the mentoring from her teacher. And I think this is also extremely important. For anybody who goes on a long retreat, no matter how long they've been in robes, unless you are like an Ajahn Brahmin, you're completely self-dependent and your practice is already extremely profound, we need to have some guidance. We need to have a teacher we can check in with, or at least a teacher who tells us whether or not he thinks or she thinks that we are ready for such a step. And so even though she was living in this cave, my mom actually asked me the question, because my mom, to my delight, was watching along with the live stream. And she asked the question, she said, yeah, but she must have eaten, wasn't there somebody feeding her? And I thought about it and I said, well, she did actually plant some like turnips and potatoes, but she did get fed also. Like somebody came once a month, I think, with dried goods like barley, or like, it's probably ground barley, like the sampa that they eat in Tibet. And so there was that sense of being held, right? And also the preparation of the mind. And just to quickly finish, because I am giving quite a long talk here, I wanted to mention that one of the best preparations for, the essential foundational preparation for all kinds of meditation practice, but especially for going into seclusion and solitude, is virtue. Yeah, the beautiful, wonderful theme of virtue, of purifying our hearts, developing beautiful, wholesome qualities within our hearts and mind. Of course, one of those is the metta, right? But also virtue implies a certain familiarity with working with our mind so that we know how to cultivate the wholesome qualities and we know how to diminish the unwholesome ones. Yeah. So initially, with virtue of body and speech, we're aiming at activities that go for the good of ourselves and others, that are for the harmony of ourselves and others. Yeah. Basically, the guiding principle is don't do anything which would hurt or harm yourself or others. And so we're abstaining from harmful behaviors and we're performing helpful behaviors, we could say. So it's not only abstinence, but it's also, for example, instead of obviously killing or harming living beings, we actually protect the lives of living beings. And there's a passage in the Majjhima Nikaya number 51, the Kandaraka Sutta, that says, with rod and weapon laid aside, one abides compassionate, with tender compassion to all living beings. And I just find that so beautiful, because we can see a little creature and okay, we're not stepping on it, but we just don't really care too much. It's like, well, I walked past it, leave it to its own fate, or you can think, oh, I need to protect this little thing. If somebody else comes, they might tread on it, or a car might squish it. Let me take it to one side, even if it's a snail or a worm or something squidgy that feels a bit, ooh, actually, they're actually not disgusting things. They're just very little tender, frightened things that are so vulnerable. And so it's nice to take that extra effort and really develop these wholesome states of mind. Yeah, and the same goes for all the other precepts. So we don't steal, obviously, we don't take what's not given, but we can be generous. We can really ask ourselves, how can I give of myself, not only financially, but how can I give of my time? How can I give of my friendship? Or how can I listen better to another person who needs to confide? How can I really make myself trustworthy? Yeah. So we don't have sexual misconduct. We are true to our word. We're reliable, trustworthy, committed. Even things like showing up on time when you say you'll be somewhere, being reliable, this is part of virtue as well. And the main principle, I think, in this context of solitude is that we have a sense that our actions do affect others. and that we're working for the common good. Yeah, we're working towards the community harmony and happiness. And that way it'll be easier to go into solitude when you get the chance. And then, of course, like I said, a skill in working with the mind, and this is called sense restraint. Yeah, Indriya Samvara Sila, which means like the restraint of the senses, basically, or the guarding, the protecting of the senses. So we learn to perceive and to attend to things in ways that do not encourage unwholesome states, such as anger or resentment to arise, but that encourage wholesome states like compassion, like forgiveness, like generosity, or simply seeing things from another angle, giving a person the benefit of the doubt, looking at their goodness rather than focusing on their faults. All these are part of preparing our mind. And one of the main reasons for this is, of course, to undermine greed and aversion and delusion in our minds, to restrain the coarser hindrances, but it's also to develop happiness. Yeah, and the Buddha said the result of practicing virtue is anavajja sukha, which means blameless bliss, a bliss that is free from remorse. Yeah, that's the reason it's blissful. You don't have remorse and regret. You don't feel guilty. You feel happy with your life. You feel like you have a healthy conscience, a clear conscience, and you can go to sleep and sleep deeply at night. Yeah, there's also another kind of bliss called it basically translates as unblemished happiness, and that's the result of sense restraint. So to me, that indicates that the happiness is starting to come from inside. It's not being tarnished by the world outside. It's not being overlaid by the world outside. For example, one time I was on retreat at Jhana Grove, and I was getting a lot of happiness and bliss coming up in my practice, to the extent that I didn't even want to really go outside my cottage, even for very long at all. So I'd just go to this small little dam, which was like, I don't know, a few steps away, and look at it and then think, yeah, that's enough now. Because the sight was almost distracting me from the bliss that was coming from within. And then I thought, maybe that's what it means by unblemished happiness. It was the same thing when I had a piece of chocolate. Normally I like a piece of chocolate, but it felt like, oh, why do I need to stimulate my tongue when I can just close my eyes and experiencing something much more refined? And so the chocolate was very unimpressive at that point. I mean, it can go the other way too, right? That you can really start to enjoy the flavors and see the beauty in the leaves and everything. But at that time, I just didn't want the distraction from the happiness that was in the mind. And it's at this point, actually, there's one more step, is that we learn to be mindful in everyday life and in our everyday activities. We learn to know what we're doing. Am I sitting? Am I speaking? Am I walking or cooking or lying down, whatever, going to the toilet? Of course, in the suttas, it says taking the robes and bowl and going on arms round. Not only what we're doing, but why we're doing it. So what's the right measure, And what's the purpose, for example, of sleep? Do I sleep too much, too little? What's the right amount? So we start to become aware, and this helps to undermine the thinking mind. We learn to be much more present with our experience now. We're coming back to the realm of pure experience rather than thinking about the experience we're having, or the experience we had like 10 years ago, right? Or that we might have in the future, because the only place you can really live and really experience anything is now, right? So we develop this mindfulness in daily life. I think the latest translation that comes from Bhante Sujata, and I'm not sure if Ajahn Brahmali also supports it, is situational awareness, which I find interesting, because it is definitely about different postures and being aware in everyday life. But I think it's more than just being aware of the situation. It's also being aware of why and how we're doing what we're doing. And hopefully to make every action an action that alleviates suffering for ourselves and others. And it's only at this point in the gradual training that the Buddha then says, one goes to a forest or to the root of a tree, to a cave, and sits down cross-legged and establishes mindfulness in front of them, or mindfulness as a priority, as Ajahn Brahm says. And then one observes the breath, or in the Majjhima 125, the Dantabhumi Sutta, it talks first about practicing the satipatthanas, the 4 satipatthanas. So at this point, depending on the inclination of our mind, we might be more inclined to states of samadhi, to the jhanas, or we might be more inclined to investigating the body and mind through the theme of the satipatthanas, along the lines of the Satipatthana Sutta. And either way, we come to the stage where the mind will quieten, the mindfulness will get very strong, very bright. And eventually, you know, we have to go through these jhanas. It's just a natural part of the path that as the mind becomes quieter and more content, it will tend to stay with whatever it's observing for longer and longer periods of time and get really absorbed into that, to the point that bliss starts to arise and the deep, deep contentment starts to arise. So much so that it almost, you could say, blinds the other senses. Like, it becomes so strong that the other senses just kind of fade off into the background. And this is where the Buddha describes real seclusion. So he says, you know, that the jhanas are states that are, let me read it because I did bring one of the suttas and it's just nice to hear the Buddha's precise words. This is from the Arana Vibhanga Sutta, but it's throughout the suttas, the same sort of sequence. So first of all, the Buddha's actually praising this kind of happiness, the happiness of jhana, as opposed to the happiness of sense pleasure, which he likens to something filthy, something ignoble, something really quite disgusting, actually, compared to the happiness and the subtlety of the mind. And also, of course, the pain and suffering we inflict when we move more towards the other extreme of self-mortification or just self-exhaustion. Staying up late on the computer, I think, is one side of that, the modern angle on that. But the Buddha says that the jhanas are things that are a wholesome happiness. And in that sense, they could be seen as the middle path between those two extremes, right? So those who say they're not a part of the path are actually not quoting the Buddha. So the Buddha says, here, monastics, quite secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unwholesome states, a monastic, or anybody, a skillful meditator, enters upon and abides in the first jhana, and then the second jhana, the third jhana, the fourth jhana. And he named all of these. He said, this is called the bliss of renunciation, nekama sukha, the bliss of seclusion, paviveka sukha. So this is deep seclusion. The bliss of peace, upasama sukha, and the bliss of enlightenment, sambodhi sukha. I say of this kind of pleasure that it should be pursued, it should be developed, it should be cultivated, and it should not be feared. So you see how, as we learn to work with the other states of mind skillfully and wisely, we can actually use them on our path. We can, you know, use it as wisdom into suffering until we're able to let go of the coarser happinesses and also the suffering that arises in the mind, and lean more and more towards the wholesome happinesses that come from within, the happinesses that emerge as a part of the beauty of the mind, right? Based on virtue, based on loving kindness, based on non-harm. We can start to experience a real sense of happiness inside that secludes us from the world in a beautiful way, so that we're no longer relying on others or on, you know, certain situations in life for our happiness. And we have this inner refuge inside that we can meet at any time. So to conclude, I would just like to recap a little bit by saying that the healthy solitude stems from a sense of belonging. Yes, and the sense of belonging is also an antidote to loneliness. So the two are actually supports for each other. And of course, if you are experiencing severe loneliness, don't just work inside with it. Reach out to others, reach out to people who may be able to provide some companionship for you, because I think one of the issues with loneliness is that we sometimes isolate ourselves in a sort of created world that's quite lonely and that's actually a creation. It's fabricated. It's not the reality. You're not alone. Okay. There are people you can reach out to. You can talk to other people in the community. You can talk to your friends. Sometimes we don't want to burden people, but they don't see it as a burden. They actually want to help. And if you don't have somebody, or if you rely on one person, try and have a few others as well. Yeah, try and have a range of people that you can contact. Of course, if you're suffering with severe depression or anxiety, especially if you're having suicidal thoughts, then seek counseling, you know. There are hotlines you can ring if it's an emergency. Otherwise, seek some professional help. There's no stigma at all in that. And that can also be an act of kindness to yourself. And from there, you can learn more skillful ways of working with these states of mind, which are completely normal, completely universal, and don't need to be stigmatized in any way. So that's just really some advice for the loneliness, because it can be a very detrimental state of mind that leads to health difficulties too. So, you know, just see what works for you. And so the preparation for solitude is important, and to know that solitude is a choice. You know, you can have periods of solitude and then come back again to your society, to your community, to your family, or whatever it is. And, you know, dip in and out, get used to it, get a feel for it. And it can start even just with a few moments every day. And I also want to encourage us to support each other, like to support each other in taking the time for solitude. So, you know, if you do have family members or people that are very demanding of your time, or if you're demanding of other people's time, see if you can give the people in your life permission to be alone from time to time, because they'll come back better. They'll come back more resourced and more willing to communicate with you, and the same for yourself. You know, sometimes if you have a partner who doesn't meditate, they can be a little bit reluctant to let you go on retreat. But when you come back from the retreat, they see there's been a change, and you're more patient and you're kinder and you're more accepting and forgiving. And so they say, off you go again. Right? So we can support each other. We can also develop social networks that don't already exist. You know, like I developed my community online during the Corona period. Or you can go and volunteer, say at nursing homes or with people with learning disabilities. Go and volunteer. Show them that they're not alone. Show them that people care. Even actually, it just popped into my mind, and perhaps that's pertinent to somebody here. There's something called a death cafe in England. I don't know if you have anything like that in Singapore, but anyway, it isn't to die at, hopefully, but it's to support people through grief. So there are places you can go and talk about any bereavement that you are experiencing or that you are about to experience, and have the support in that particularly lonely state of mind. Of course, monasteries, developing monasteries, and I have to say this because that's what we're trying to do, but I think monasteries can be really a perfect place to have a balance between community activity and service and also time alone. So rather than just going on retreat, which is complete solitude, and then coming back to a busy life, we can actually come out of retreat into a community that understands how sensitive you become, how to integrate it in daily life, and how to maintain your virtue as well of body and speech once you do start to communicate again with each other. So lastly, I'd just like to say that the real true purpose of solitude is to develop deep meditation. And of course, the deepest meditation of all is to transcend the body and the mind completely. So even in the jhanas, it's a stepping stone to that. But eventually, through the insight that we can gain from deep meditation, we start to let go of the whole world, this whole world of suffering, so that greed, craving, delusion, and ill will gradually fade away. And it's really beautiful to end with a quote from the Ratana Sutta, where the Buddha actually says that Nibbana gamim paramam hitaya. It means Nibbana. The Buddha goes to Nibbana for the ultimate benefit, for the highest benefit of all beings. So by actually taking those steps on this path, by becoming more and more secluded, and by developing a love of solitude, we actually benefit others to the highest degree. So imagine that even disappearing from this world can be the highest gift we can give to others. disappearing in a beautiful way, in a way that, you know, your whole life becomes a service. Your whole life becomes sharing the Dhamma in a way that inspires others to do the same. So I would like to end there and also open for any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
Thank you, Venerable Chanda. Thank you for the very inspiring talk. We can really feel your kindness and compassion from your practice.
Oh.
Yeah, so we have 5 questions so far. So the first question is, solitude gives opportunity for the mind to chatter. So how can one overcome this?
Yeah, that's true. And it's okay. Let the mind chatter at first because the mind's chattering all day anyway, right? So it's not that you're really giving it more opportunity. It's just that you're starting to see how much it chatters anyway. And sometimes we have to see that in order to realize that that chattering is really quite useless. You know, at first we believe in our thoughts. We believe in them so much that we follow them in all kinds of unhealthy directions. You know, we allow them to take us to the depths, to the dungeons in the mind. But once we actually see, when we close our eyes and we have a look at those thoughts, we first of all see that it is quite a disturbance and that it is suffering, right? To have an overthinking mind. And by noticing that, we actually start to develop what's called nibbida to the thinking mind. So we develop a kind of sense of dispassion, a sense of turning away, getting tired of this thinking mind. And gradually, as the meditation develops, we start to tune in to the silence between the thoughts. So rather than pushing the thoughts away, we can notice that the thoughts themselves are just like chatter, like the chatter of birds or children. We don't have to give it too much importance or get too upset by it. Just let it be there, you know, like clouds in the sky, just coming and going. But also notice that there are times that you're not thinking and there are pauses between the thoughts. And in those pauses, there is peace. So on the one hand, we're starting to see that the thoughts are suffering. On the other hand, we're starting to see that the silence is beautiful. And bit by bit, that teaches the mind. So the mind starts to learn where its true happiness lies, and it starts to incline more in that direction. But I think the most important thing is not to fight them. Okay, so there's a sutta, there's a whole sutta on thinking. Well, 2 actually. It's the Majjhima number 19 and number 20. Number 19 is called 2 Kinds of Thought, and that talks about the thoughts that are wholesome and the thoughts that are unwholesome. It might help you to know that even the Buddha, before he was enlightened, struggled with unwholesome thoughts. Okay, so he also had thoughts that were based on ill will, that were based on craving, and that were based on cruelty, even cruelty. But he also saw that there are thoughts that are based on non-ill will, in other words, metta, that are based on non-harm or non-cruelty, which is gentleness, compassion, and that there were thoughts based on renunciation as well. So the first thing he did was realize there were these 2 kinds of thoughts. And he said, you know, this one kind of thoughts, one kind, the unwholesome ones are for my harm and they don't lead to enlightenment. And the wholesome thoughts are for my benefit for myself and others, and they do lead to enlightenment. So just recognizing that was the answer, the initial answer for him. Because after a while, he realized, you know, I don't want to follow those unwholesome thoughts. It's not leading anywhere good. Okay, so just recognize what's there first. You can't skip that step. You can't just close your eyes and expect to have either no thought or just beautiful thoughts. That's not the way it goes. We're learning about our mind. And then in the second sutta, the Majjhima 20, which is called Vitakka Santana Sutta, it's about how to overcome thoughts. It actually is translated as how to overcome distracting thoughts, but the word distracting is not actually there. It actually is just how to overcome thoughts. And it gives 5 methods. And the first method is, if I can remember it properly, the first method is substitution. Okay, so this is a bit similar to what I said before, just not really following the unwholesome thoughts, but it's also like intentionally putting in a more positive thought. So for example, if you're thinking, this person, they just cut me off in traffic, they're really selfish, you change the thought. Okay, this person was in a hurry, maybe they just, I don't know, needed the toilet, or maybe their wife was about to give birth, or whatever. You don't know. So you substitute the thought. It can also be, one really great way of substituting thoughts, if your mind is determined to think, is to actually intentionally have thoughts of loving kindness. Like we did in the meditation just at the end. May I be happy. May I be peaceful. May I be liberated. Or whatever thought brings you happiness and feels genuine and sincere. So sometimes that's also a way to start working with thoughts in a more skillful way. The second way to overcome them is to see the danger in unwholesome thoughts. So again, very similar to the previous way of differentiating between wholesome and unwholesome. See the danger, see how you're wasting your time, how it's not really leading anywhere. But be careful with this. Don't beat yourself up, right? Because if we see the danger, then we might say, I'm so crazy for doing this. It's not like you're really in danger. It's just that you're wasting your time by following it a lot. And that's okay. It's inevitable. So don't worry about it. But it's almost like you're saying, look, mind, look, mind. Don't go there, go here. Look, mind. You see, that's not really helpful. See, mind? Just the way you talk to a child, you wouldn't be like slap the child. No, you just say, look, if you put your hand in the fire, it hurts, right? Just don't do it. So, and then I don't know if it's the third one is like ignoring the thoughts. So not giving them too much attention. And that was my first kind of feeling when you mentioned this question. It's just don't worry about it. Just don't give them a lot of fuel. Just, notice when they're not there. Let them fall off the screen of the mind. Just let them be there because they settle down in their own time. I said it during the talk that the first time I was really without thinking for prolonged periods of time was after months. I'd had 10 years of dedicated practice before I ordained, but then after I ordained, it was about 4 months of meditation, like 16 hours a day, okay, until the mind really became quiet. So my mind likes to think. So it's normal. It's just normal, and don't make a problem out of it. And then another way, one more thing, another way is to notice. Now, what do they say? They sort of say stilling the thought formation is the fourth method in this sutta. And that sort of means, like, I think, seeing where it's coming from, like seeing if it's coming from greed or anger, and just pacifying that sort of underlying cause. Like, don't go in that direction. Notice it before the thought actually becomes a verbal thought. And only the last one is to suppress the thought. And this is in an emergency. For example, if you think, I got to get this person and show them or speak to them in such and such a way, then suppress that thought, because you're going to cause a lot of harm and you're going to generate very much unwholesome karma for yourself. So I suggest having a look at those suttas.
That's excellent advice, Venerable.
Good.
The second question. So the second question is, sometimes one does not wish to mingle and chat in a social setting as it affects the meditation practice afterwards. So how do we actually balance this in our practice?
Yeah, I think this is very common, especially when you start to practice more and you start to be more aligned with what really matters in your own life and where your real interest and commitment lies. And sometimes it can feel, for me also, a little bit of a time waste, a little bit exhausting and kind of meaningless to just have random chit chat that's not related to the path. But don't worry, this is natural. And actually the Buddha praised not having lots of chit chat. He actually said that the kind of talk that he praises is talk about contentment, talk about fewness of wishes, talking about practice, talking about the path, talking about things that inspire you. So bit by bit on the path, I think, obviously we have to develop and make peace with situations we can't avoid. But at the same time, I think we do start to choose friends that are also practicing so that we can have conversations that are more meaningful for us. And yeah, I guess I was quite lucky because I started practicing in India when I was 19, and most of the people I was meeting were other people that were going for retreats. So if they weren't, I was sort of suggesting they should. So I used to talk about it all the time to people that were anyway looking for a path. And it was so supportive to me to be able to share my enthusiasm and, you know, see people coming for retreats and then seeing them change. And it was just so wonderful. And bit by bit, I just did gravitate away, I guess, from meaningless chit chat. So yeah, it's okay. I mean, don't do it all at once. Don't just dump all your old friends or anything like that. But, you know, in time, you might just find that your friendship group changes a little bit. And if not, then just see if you can relate to the conversation with kindness. Don't get too caught up in the content. Because what I noticed actually with my old friends and family is that sometimes the talk seems meaningless, it seems trivial, but sometimes the words are just ways to connect. Like sometimes the conversation doesn't really matter what it's about. It's just a way to like relate to each other and to show that we're kind of connected in this life. Yeah. So see if you can relate to it with kindness. And bit by bit, you might find if you do have that kindness and patience, they might even ask you about your practice and you might be able to share a little more of what's meaningful for you. Don't be afraid to be who you are. You know, don't be afraid to say that you don't drink, or, you know, or to say that you don't enjoy nightclubs. Or sometimes other people feel the same, but they just don't want to say it, you know. So by giving yourself permission to be who you are, you give others permission too. And you might find that people are more interested in your life than you realize. So I hope that helps.
That's really great, really good advice. Okay, we have another question here. Heard people have gone crazy from being alone. Is it possible to go nuts with solitude?
Yeah, I was actually going to mention this, and I sort of touched on it in the talk, that you do need to be prepared. You need to have like enough emotional stability, enough familiarity with the workings of your mind. You need to know yourself first in shorter periods of solitude before you go into longer periods of solitude. And there are situations, you know, that you hear about of crazy hermits, you know, people that just go off into the forest, into the bush or whatever, and come out somewhat wild and a little bit mad. And I think that is when solitude has moved into isolation. So they don't have enough references to keep them on track. And this is why, you know, in the beginning, it's really helpful to have, say, a teacher-led retreat where you're sitting with other people, perhaps a retreat where there's more structure. For some people, that's helpful. You know, this is an hour for sitting, an hour or half an hour for walking, then sitting, walking. Some people need a bit less structure, but still there's a teacher present. And as I say, even on long retreats, I always check in with Ajahn Brahm once a week. I mean, it's just a gift that is there for me. And I mean, obviously I'm going to make use of that, but I want to make use of that because I know that if I'm going like a little bit too far this way or that way, he will be able to say, he'll be able to know. He hasn't had to say that yet, but the fact that somebody would, or, you know, is aware gives me a lot of confidence that things are going okay, you know. So yes, it is possible. And I actually read that isolation, one of the side effects can be even things like schizophrenia, or like, what do they call it? Schizoid personality disorder. I mean, I read this is from some scientific research, but again, I think this is probably when the isolation is involuntary and when we don't have a good understanding of our mind. I don't want to say that to scare anybody because this is an extreme situation and it's probably very rare. Okay, but I do want to emphasize that, you know, solitude should be, if it's solitude by choice, then we need to prepare our minds with a very strong foundation of virtue, first of all, so that there are qualities in our minds that we know we can lean on, that we know we can use as our refuge, and we can even work to bring those up in our minds. So, you know, things like reflecting on our virtue, reflecting on our generosity and goodness, and also reflecting that we have friends out there in the world. Yeah, we do have friends. And yeah, for me on retreat this time, it's always very helpful, for example, when people send things or when people come with food, obviously. And this is important in the monastic life, that we have that relationship, that ongoing relationship with our lay supporters, so that, you know, they hold us accountable. They only support us if we're honest. And also, you know, we have to stay integrated to some extent into the world. We can't just go off for years and years and, you know, get completely dissociated from what's happening in the world and then expect to come back and feel integrated. It's a practice. You know, the solitude has to be integrated gradually over time. So yeah, do it in steps, in stages, but don't worry about the other. I mean, the only reason that would happen is if somebody goes off when they're really not ready and without any guidance and even obstinately against their teacher's will. I think the fact that you asked the question shows that's not you. Okay, so don't worry.
Thank you, Venerable. The next question: can extreme solitude or loneliness cause dementia for seniors, as they will not be socializing to keep their brain active?
I wish I could say no, but I also read some research that did say that extreme solitude and isolation, not solitude, isolation and loneliness does increase our risk of things like heart disease, anxiety, depression, and actually can increase the risk of dementia. Now, I don't really know how much this has been tested because I'm a monastic and not a research scientist or a doctor. But I think, yeah, it just points to the Buddha's advice on the importance of spiritual friendship and the importance of community, you know. And I think that's one of the really sad and tragic things in sort of, I want to say Western, but it's really capitalistic societies. Yeah, any society that's become extremely materialistic and capitalistic, whereby there's a gap, the gap widens and ever increases between the rich and the poor. And we do forget to look after our elderly. We forget to go visit even our parents, maybe in nursing homes, or, you know, people. I heard about one person in Japan that died months before anyone found the body. You know, these things actually can happen. And yeah, I do think that, of course, if the brain is not staying active and if you're emotionally, you know, alone, it will have negative psychological effects, unless you're really well practiced in the Dhamma and you know the workings of your mind and how to work with the mind in a skillful way. So this is why we have to practice now, isn't it? Because I think for people, you know, that are well practiced and that know how to be on retreat, they don't have these kind of worries anymore. They know that they would be fine alone. And actually, ironically, those people probably never will be alone because they've got so much metta and compassion, you know, that people will look after them in their life. So yeah, I don't know. Does that help at all?
Yeah, it helps. I guess like during this COVID period, right? Like they're more elderly, they are more isolated.
Yeah.
We probably have to make an effort to reach out to them as well.
Yeah. It's really great that that's raised, actually. I think for the elderly, for like people that live alone, even that might not be so elderly, even for people that are in families or in situations where, you know, there may be abuse happening. That is also just as terrifying. You know, these people are just as alone and isolated as people that are physically alone. So that also unfortunately increased a lot during COVID, you know, instances of domestic abuse, etc. And sometimes children might be in families where the parents, you know, shout at them a lot and they don't have the normal outlets with their teachers and their friends at school. So really, I mean, it's important, especially as the restrictions loosen and the vaccination rates sort of increase, that we, as much as possible and in a safe way, do try to reach out, I think, to each other and to particularly vulnerable communities that may have been most affected at this time. If you can't reach out personally, you can always support charities and stuff that do that kind of work as well. So
yeah. In Singapore, we have a charity group called, I think, Thinker Friend. It's like a helpline where children
Great.
can call in, when they're being when they're feeling down or suicidal.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's wonderful. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Yeah.
So now we come to our last question. So the last question is, does solitude exaggerate a certain emotion which may cause pain to the meditator?
Yes, it could exaggerate any emotion. I'm not sure it's really exaggerating it. It's maybe more that there's a lack of distraction. So these emotions become more obvious, more clear. But just as it will emphasize, perhaps we can say, perhaps some so-called unwholesome emotions, it can also emphasize the beautiful emotions too. And I think in meditation, for me, the guiding principle is that it's not so much the content of your experience that's important as the way you learn to relate to it. So even if there is a so-called unwholesome, that's why I say so-called, because, okay, say anger or irritation arises, of course, we know it's not going to be particularly, it's a harmful emotion, especially if we let it roll for a long time, and especially if we act on it, right? But at the same time, it was there anyway. I mean, unless you're an anagami, we all have greed, hate, and delusion. I mean, unless you're an arahat, you still, I don't know, does an anagami still have a bit of delusion, I think, because they still sometimes think in terms of a self. So it's bound to come up. It's there anyway. And the opportunity that meditation and solitude gives you is a chance to learn to relate to it wisely. And it's in that relating to it wisely that it has a chance to be seen, understood, and also the kind of force of suffering to be dissipated. Because if we can be at peace with an emotion, even if we're feeling, say, anxiety, and we're actually at peace with that, we've just genuinely allowed it to be. It's like, okay, anxiety, you're here, I respect you, you're welcome, I'm not going to push you away. Let me see what you have to teach me. Let me see what you have to say. And we learn to stay with that just for a shortish time, not for forever, in a gentle way. Then after a while, the overriding emotion in the mind is actually the making peace. It's actually the kindness, because it's the way that we relate to it that is almost like the quality of the mind in the moment. Like the emotion that arises is due to old karma, it's due to old causes and conditions. But in this moment, if you're reacting and making peace with that, with loving kindness, with compassion, with gentleness, with patience, then you're creating the causes for future happiness. You're creating good karma in the moment. So don't worry, whatever arises in the mind is an opportunity to, first of all, learn to relate to it wisely. And secondly, to see its nature, to see that it's actually impermanent, that it is conditioned. That means it doesn't belong to you, right? If something's conditioned, it means it's due to causes. It's dependently arisen. So it can't be permanent and it can't be yours. It's due to a cause. When that cause disappears, so does the emotion. So be happy that it's coming. Be happy that it's coming up. But again, don't take huge chunks of solitude without any guidance, because we can forget these little things, right? We just get consumed by them. And if you don't have a good teacher to remind you, well, how are you looking at that? How are you relating to that? Then it can get a little intense.
Thank you, Venerable. I think Sis Jenny wants to ask a question. So Sis Jenny, can you unmute yourself?
Thank you, Venerable, for the valuable sharing. I just want to ask, I know that in Thailand, like some of the meditators that are more advanced, they would prefer to go to the forest and then do their meditation in solitude. Is it like a prerequisite, like if you want to improve into a meditation, other than having a teacher to consult on your progress? And since we are living in the city state in Singapore, I know that it may not be happening soon.
Yeah.
But what do you think about solitude in the forest?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. So I think what I understand from the question is that, like, is it a requirement, yes, to be in solitude, say in a jungle, and can we cultivate that kind of solitude even in a busy place like a city? Or is that right? Did I catch you? Yeah. So I mean, I think, the fact that people, and especially monastics, would go into the forest in Thailand, it might not be so much that it's necessary as much as the fact that it's possible. So because they've already trained in monasteries, and because there was, and at least in those days, a lot of forest to go to, then of course, if they felt ready, they had that chance. That doesn't necessarily mean that, they needed to do that, or that is the main cause that got them enlightened, if they're enlightened, or that got them into, deep meditation. It's just that it fitted with the cultural context, and it fitted with the opportunities that were there. So I think for most people these days, I mean, we do have different lifestyles. And one interesting thing that seems to be happening even around monasteries is that forest monasteries are becoming less and less common. And some monks and nuns are choosing to live in cities and be more accessible to the lay people. But they're still choosing lifestyles that give them a lot of opportunity for practice. And that's the main thing, I think. I also think that if you do go into solitude in a forest, of course, first of all, you have to be ready. Secondly, you have to have an inclination for that. It doesn't suit everybody. But you still have to come back to the world and learn to live in the world. If your meditation depends entirely on having perfect conditions, then it's not going to really hold up when you do have to come back even to the monastery. I mean, even monasteries can be busy places, just as busy sometimes as sitting in an office. I sit a lot in the office nowadays, and I'm really busy with my practice, but I still make sure that I take my time every day to meditate. And I also take time on retreats. So I think it's that balance that's really important. And for me personally, when I see different kinds of practitioners, sure, I think it's great if you can have long periods of practice. But what inspires me most is people that are able to integrate that when they get back into community. And it's one reason that Ajahn Brahm, I just knew, it wasn't even I chose him. He came to me through a little CD while I was still in Myanmar. And within 2 talks, I knew this is, I have to find this teacher. This is my teacher. It just spoke to the heart. And one reason was the obvious profundity in which he gave the talks that obviously came from experience. To me, it was very obvious. These talks were like the Rains retreat talks of the early 2000s, late 1990s. And it was very clear that what he was speaking about in terms of jhanas and deeper insights was coming from experience. So that really inspired me. But the bit that inspired me even more was realizing that, he'd say in a talk that he'd just been to Singapore teaching in front of like 4,000 people, and having, like just getting off the plane and doing that, and then flying to London and getting off the plane and doing talk after talk. I was like, wow. This is amazing, somebody that can go to such depth in meditation. And I don't think he had long periods in the forest without any other involvement with community, like Wat Papong, Wat Nanachat were community places. So yeah, you could meditate a lot, but you also had to live in community. You had to do some work, right? So he had an integrated practice, and that was what inspired me, that he was now just as content in his cave in Bodhinyana as he was traveling on the road giving talks to 4,000 people. And I just found that incredible. And I thought, yeah, I want that. I want to develop that. I mean, personally, for me, I'd have liked a lot longer in Myanmar and to develop a lot deeper meditation first before giving so much service. But I don't know. I don't think it really matters. I think everybody's path is unique, and we make the best with the situation we have. I mean, I have spent probably quite foolishly quite a bit of time in my monastic life thinking, oh, if only I could have stayed longer in Myanmar, gone deeper in my meditation before having to serve and to teach. And, I wanted to get like stream entry, like in this life. And, I'm sure I could have done it if that would have continued, blah, blah, blah. And but this is so silly, because this is buying into the idea of time, isn't it? And really, does it matter? I mean, if I take a few more lifetimes or whatever, and who knows, right? It could happen. Maybe anytime. It could happen to any of us anytime. We don't know, right? But does it really matter? Because eventually what I know I would like is to have a practice that is obviously going to get me out of suffering, but also gives me the opportunity to develop the skills that can help others too. And so, you know, I think this is really inspiring when you see people like this. You know, I mean, I think Ajahn Brahmali is an example of that, because he's done a lot of cultivation, like a lot of foundational work and study and all this. And, you know, it maybe took longer than an Ajahn Brahm to develop the practice, the meditation. But I mean, the results are so obvious, right? It's like there's a certain stability and depth there. And you find other monastics or even lay people, I've met lay people who supposedly get into deep jhanas quite quickly, but then they come back into the world and they break their sila and, you know, they're really unstable. So personally, I don't think it matters too much, but it is important to try and set time aside every day for solitude, you know, and it doesn't have to be silent. I mean, I've sat in Burma in a meditation hall that they were building. Like I was sitting in the front of the hall and they were building the back part of the hall. And in Myanmar, they have these ceilings that are made of like latticed woodwork, like little squares, tiny squares all across the ceiling, like wood. And they knock it in with nails. So it's got this pretty pattern. And they were banging with hammers as I was sitting in the meditation hall. I sat a whole 10-day retreat like that. And you could hear the banging even from the dormitory. And it wasn't a problem to me, you know, because I understood that meditation is just to work with what's arising and to develop a good attitude to it and to see that it's, you know, impermanent and I don't have to suffer because of that. So I don't know if that gives some encouragement, but I think rather than ask what's necessary, it's more like, how can I make use of the conditions I have? How can I make best use of the conditions I have?
Thank you, Venerable. We are very lucky to have you back from your long retreat, because Ajahn Brahm and Ajahn Brahmali, you are all gems to our community as well.
Oh,
Yeah, so thank you so much. Shall we all pay respects to Venerable? First bow.
Maybe, Sister, maybe we ask Venerable to share merits
All
and
right.
we give a blessing before we end.
yes, good. I was hoping to do that. So just in English, first of all, I'd like to thank everybody here for this wonderful opportunity to meet with you again and to discuss the Dhamma, because it's always very inspiring to do that, especially with people who are so receptive and have so much love for the Dhamma in their hearts, you know, and especially because you're all such strong, devoted disciples of Ajahn Brahm and Ajahn Brahmali, and it feels like a family in that way. It creates a better sense of belonging for me, because I am here alone. So thank you very much. And may these teachings, or any little part of the teaching that can help you, may that help you on your path. And I'd like to end by chanting a little Burmese blessing, which spreads loving kindness to all beings everywhere. Sabbe sata, sabbe pana, sabbe bhuta, sabbe pugala, sabbe atabhawa pariyapana, sabbe itio, sabbe purisa, sabbe ariya, sabbe anariya, sabbe deva, sabbe manusa, sabbe vinipadika, aweva hontu, abhyapaja hontu, anika hontu, sukhiyatana pariharantu, dukkha munjantu, yadalada sampatito, mawe gacchantu, kamasaka. Sadhu. Sadhu. Sadhu.
Sadhu.
Very good. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Venerable Canda.
Take care.
Let's
you,
pay
Venerable.
respects to Venerable with 3 bows. Bow. Second bow. Third bow.
Thank you very much for tuning in together with us today. Do note that on Friday, we have a special event in memoriam. You are welcome to make a donation in the name of your departed loved ones if you wish to dedicate merits to them. All donations will go towards BF's Building Fund. The following day, on the 1st of January, Ajahn Brahmali will be giving us a special talk titled Worried About 2022, How to Ensure It Will Be Better Than 2021 Regardless. Do join us on Facebook Live and do note that on that day, BF West will be closed. Sister Sylvia Bay will be giving us another special talk on the 2nd of January at 10:30 a.m. She will be talking about respect, humility, contentment, and gratitude. Do join us. BF West will be open on that day, so do sign up on Eventbrite. We hope to see you soon.
We will now invite all the sentient beings to participate in our acquired merits for cultivating the wholesome thoughts, wholesome speech, and wholesome actions this morning. Let us now chant together. Etawata ca amhehi sambatang punya sampadang sabbe dewa anumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etawata ca amhehi sambatang punya sampadang sabbe buddha anumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. Etawata ca amhehi sambatang punya sampadang sabbe satta anumodantu sabba sampati siddhya. The dedication of merits to our departed relatives. Let us chant together. Idang me nyati nang hotu sukita hontu nyatayo. Idang me nyati nang hotu sukita hontu nyatayo. Idang me nyati nang hotu sukita hontu nyatayo. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.